Hi, it's Dr. Crone. Welcome to our unit on economic development. This is a follow-up unit to our previous unit on the political economy. In this unit, we'll see how countries attempt to move their economies and their societies ahead. Economic development is usually considered to be the process by which a country changes or advances, and often that is measured in terms of economic growth. So how fast is a country growing? How is it moving from, let's say, poverty into wealth, or from a less developed economy where there isn't a lot of wealth in the country to a more developed economy. But development is more than just GDP or economic growth. It's got a lot of different elements to it. And so we can see from this slide that development does have to do absolutely with the GDP. So the growth in GDP per capita, as we see countries becoming more wealthy, less impoverished, we see that's what often economists and political scientists are talking about when they talk about development. But there's more than that to development. So political scientists might talk about things like standard of living, quality of life, how long a person lives, the kind of healthcare they have, the quality of the environment. This is sort of a new measure of development of, how polluted is the air and the water, things like that. And then how much is the country promoting freedom and equality for minorities or across genders? So social scientists use different measures and rely on different measures when they're trying to estimate a country's level of development. So some are satisfied to use purely economic measures. So those are good measures of economic development. Things like we talked about GDP per capita. Again, per capita means that we're controlling for the number of people in the population. So we're not going to say that a small country is necessarily not well developed. So we're looking at what is the total wealth in the country divided by the number of people there. And of course, we're going to use that purchasing power parity measure that we looked at last time to make sure that we're controlling for the various costs of living across different countries. So using a controlled measure, GDP per capita, purchasing power parity, one of the most common ways to measure development is increase in GDP, in other words, growth, or how much the growth is changing from one year to another. Or we could also look at poverty rates. That's another way to do it. But there are other aspects to development, as we looked at on the previous slide, and there have been quite a number of attempts to measure the more social aspects of development, and the United Nations has a very well-utilized measure that they call the Human Development Index that tries to get at measuring that concept. So the UNHDI, Human Development Index, is going to measure some things like life expectancy, infant mortality rates, education levels, how long do the average person stay in school, literacy rates, things like that. And there are different measures than just the UNHDI, but that is a very good measure to use if you're looking to try to capture social development. The good thing for us as political scientists is that the thing we know is that there is a strong correlation between the measures, the purely economic measures of development and the measures of social development. In other words, a country that scores high on GDP per capita or on growth is going to show higher levels of social development, and that's going to be reflected on that measure. So we don't have to be super critical if we see a country or if we see a social scientist who's just relying on economic measures, because we can be pretty sure that those are also capturing social development as well. But it is very interesting to look at those measures of social development. So speaking of that, using that UNHDI, the nice thing is that that gets calculated for all the member countries of the United Nations, which is most of the countries in the world. Not all, but most of the countries in the world. And we can see from this chart, this shows sort of the size of that Human Development Index across the globe. And using the measure of the HDI, we can quantify every country's level of development, and we know we have a comparative measure. And we know that the UN's measures are reliable and sound so that we can feel comfortable about doing that. So you can see from this map, one thing that's very instructive is to see the regional nature of development. You can see how the less developed countries are included in that sort of Central African area. Certainly the continent of Africa, much less developed. We're going to get into lots of discussion in a minute about why that might be. Certainly North America, Russia, places like that, much more highly developed economies and highly developed societies as well. So another thing that we can do with that UN measure is we can actually look, and rather than just looking at a map, we can look at the individual member measures, and we can look to see what measures sort of make up that, and that gives us interesting ways to compare different aspects of the HDI measure for different countries. So as with our slides last time, I took several of the countries that we have case studies for and looked up this data. And what I want you to take away is a bunch of things about the UN HDI measure. So first of all, the HDI is a scale from 0 to 1. So it is a decimal point scale. 1.0 would be the very highest you could have. 0.0 would be the very lowest. So we can look at that overall measure. And then we can also look at some of the measures that go into that. And so I chose some of these out of the chart. One thing that goes into that measure is the life expectancy of a newborn person in that country. And so, for example, in the United States today, for kids being born right now, you're expected to live almost 79 years. And life expectancy has a lot to do with the quality of the healthcare system in a country. It also has to do with poverty, maternal nutrition, the ability to treat communicable diseases, vaccination rates, all of those kind of things. So that's what life expectancy is. And then we have two measures of education that I think are interesting. The one on the left of the two is expected years of school, and that is specifically for kids who are today entering school. So in the United States, again, a kid entering school today, we would expect on average that that person would accomplish 16 years of school. So that means that for kids entering school today, the average child will have completed college, will have completed 4 years of college. Now that doesn't mean every single kid will, but that means on average they will. The other measure that's just to the right of that is the mean years of school, just looking at people over the age of 25 in the country. So here we can see that almost every country, I believe it's true for all the countries, that column is lower. And that's what we would normally expect to see in most countries. We expect that as the generations pass, there is a higher expectation and a higher level of education attained by people in that country. The only thing that would change that would be if a country experienced a really bad war or significant disruption where schools were not available for a certain amount of time, and then we might see that the expected years of school was less than mean years. So you can see here in the United States that on average today, the average American has only a little bit of education past high school, whereas for kids that are coming into school, the average American child entering school today will probably get a college degree, or is most likely to get or have 4 extra years beyond high school. So it's interesting to just look at these. There are other measures that go into the HDI, and these are the ones that I just kind of pulled out because I thought they were kind of interesting for us to look at. The other thing, so we can look at the United States and see how that is, or we can also compare that with the other countries. So the rank is also if every country is ranked by their HDI value. So starting with those closest to number 1 and going to those that are closest to 0. And there are 167 member nations of the United Nations. So the lowest number would be, or the highest number would be 167. That would mean you were at the bottom of the HDI. The best, of course, would be number 1, which is Norway. And so you can see here the United States is 15. We see Germany outranks us. Their HDI value is slightly higher. All across the board, all of their measures are slightly higher than the United States, not a lot of difference. We see significantly lower with Brazil and Russia and China. And then with Nigeria, we see a country that is far less developed. We would call Nigeria a developing country. And you can see there their values, and especially look at that life expectancy in Nigeria and see that really steep drop off in a country that has not good healthcare infrastructure and also not good maternal nutrition and maternal health care when during pregnancy, which is a big indicator of life expectancy is the maternal, your mother's prenatal care that they got and the ability to have plenty of food during pregnancy. So that's what that looks like. Okay, so right now it's time for you to jump in here and try to do some research on your country. I'm going to have you guys look up your UN HDI ranking for 2019 or for whatever year you happen to be watching this video. I'm creating this video in 2019. So let me tell you a little bit about how to do this. So the picture here is a picture of what the web page with all the data looks like. So you see it is the United Nations Development Program Human Development Reports, which are up there in the left-hand corner. And then you're going to see the Human Development Index ranking. So that's right here. That actually is a pretty good search term to use if when you're looking for this web page, is to search using just the words Human Development Index ranking. And you want to make sure you've got the most recent year. And when you are able to pull up that page, then the search box is over there on the top right of the page. I have a red circle around it. That's where you'll want to type in the name of your country. And then when you get that, what you're going to see is that you have a column on the left, which is the rank. So that's the rank of your country. Then the country name. And then proceeding to the right, you have the Human Development Index number. And then to the right of that, you have a variety of different pieces of data. So what I'd like you to do is pause this video now that you kind of know what you're doing. Maybe keep it open and flip to searching for this data. Just try to find this web page and search for your data. And then once you do, I'd like you to write down the same, make note of the data for your country, similar to the data that I had on the previous slide. So if you need to back up the recording and go see what that slide looked like, maybe take a screenshot of it, feel free to do that. So save that out and then use that information in your discussion board post for this week. And be sure you include it because that'll be part of your grade. If your post is missing this, it'll be some points off. And if you need any help, if you try to find this data and you can't find it, feel free to drop by my office hours or email me and I'd be glad to help you. I can send you a link to it or something like that if you're just having trouble Googling it or using a search engine to find it, or if you're confused about this at all. So I'm happy to help you with that. All right, so let's look at developing countries for the rest of our video here. So generally speaking, we talk about the difference between a developed country in the United States and Germany, and really most of the countries in the top 20 or so are considered to be developed nations or developed countries. And then we talk about the ones that are pretty far down on the scale with pretty low HDI indexes or very low wealth or per capita, those kind of things. We call those developing countries. A while back in time, for example, when I was a graduate student, we often referred to these countries as first world countries, were considered developed nations. Second world countries were somewhere in the middle, and then third world countries were those that would be low on the development scale. And over time, I'm very grateful to say that the social sciences have progressed away from that sort of pejorative terminology that seems to say that, you know, wealthy countries are the best, to the distinction between developing and developed. There really aren't any undeveloped countries because all countries are at least in having the goal of trying to develop. So what are some of the political challenges that we see in developing countries? So there's a whole list of them here. Um, Infrastructure is not good. Lack of natural resources, or there are resources but no access to those. So things like coal or oil or diamonds or something like that. Um, Problems with the environment, big impact of climate change. In fact, one of the major concerns of the United Nations in dealing with climate change is that it will hit the developing nations harder than it will hit the developed nations. The more developed you are, the easier it is to use non-polluting strategies. And in fact, one of the controversies about the global response to climate change is that the highest polluters are developing nations, but the developing nations don't. They want the developed nations to shoulder some of the financial burden of helping them to deal with this, partly because the developed nations like the United States and Great Britain and places like that, we polluted our atmosphere to grow in the 1900s, and now it's easier for us to sort of clean up our act and make cleaner air. But that's partly because we're a wealthy country that has an excellent tax base and things like that. So that is a global controversy. Poor healthcare we talked about, major public health emergencies like infections, viruses, problems with lack of vaccination for common things like measles or infectious diseases like that. Problems when there is an environmental problem often will cause a public health emergency like cholera when the water is tainted because of people not having plumbing that is working. Often that goes along with flooding and things like that. So major problems like that. Very high levels of population growth with little or no family planning access for women. So that's a major concern of the United Nations is trying to get countries access to birth control, women in countries, and to educate women about family planning, because the higher the population, the more of the burden on the developing nation economically. Overcrowded cities. Often violence against women is a major problem in developing countries, equality and violence, hunger and food shortages, or just unreliable food supply, unreliable water supply, often unsafe, poor sanitation, which can then lead to those public health emergencies, and then a corrupt or low capacity government. And actually, capacity and development seem to go in many ways hand in hand. So often what we see are that higher capacity governments are associated with better economic development, better levels of development. So for example, a state like the United States, we have a very high capacity government, and that's regardless of what you think about the current governing politicians, but essentially our bureaucracy functions well and all of that kind of thing. So we have a higher capacity government, so does Britain, so does Germany, so does Norway, places like that, and we also have high levels of economic development. So one thing that you might think about and talk about on your discussion board is, which order do you think the causation is in? Is it that higher capacity government leads to better economic development? Or do you think it's that higher levels of economic development, a wealthier country is going to have a higher capacity government? So think about which direction you think that causality would go. And I think your textbook has some more on that as well. So one thing we want to be sure that we do is not fall into a trap of thinking that there's some simple way we can explain how a country got developed or their level of development, or that we can explain, or we can't come up with some simplistic one-size-fits-all law about, well, this country is at, their HDI measure is 0.5 right now, and in 3 years, if they do these things, it'll be up to 0.6. That is not possible in comparative politics, and it's not possible in public policy. And in many ways, there are similarities, but every country's development is unique because of its unique history, the historical context it fits into, the regional context, so what is development like in the region that it is, and then also the political context. Have they had democratic government? Have they had authoritarian government? Have they suffered from wars and lack of, stable state or something like that? So in order to understand this, we have to be sure we don't get out over our skis and try to say things about economic development that we really don't have evidence for. So be sure to treat economic development when you talk about your own country. Be sure to treat it as in a humble way, that you don't know all the answers. Nobody does. So just to give you an example of historical context, one thing that really we know affects development is the country's history of colonization. So for example, was the country a colonizer from the 1600s to the 1900s of the past century or the past millennium? So countries that were colonizers, in other words, they were out there colonizing other countries, were Britain, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, and the Netherlands. Those are kind of the big seven. I may have, Portugal. Sorry, I know I missed one. When we look at those countries, they do tend to have high levels of development. And we can look back into history and say, well, their economic development was facilitated by the fact that they had resources available to them from the economies of their subjugated countries or their colonies. Then again, on the other side of things, the countries that were colonized, some of them are developed countries like the US, Australia, and Canada. Others, not so much. So one of the things that political scientists talk about is, for what purpose was a colonized country colonized? And there are basically two primary reasons that the colonizers engaged in colonization. The first one was really the oldest one, and that was population pressure within the home country. So for example, Britain was experiencing in the 1600s, was experiencing enormous population growth, and they were running out of room on their small island. And so often when countries experience population growth, that creates internal conflict, which is going to kill off your economic development if you have a civil war or something like that. Scarce resources, that kind of things. But what Britain was able to do to sort of solve their population process or problem was to colonize places that had a lot of land and very few people. So the United States, Australia, and Canada, all of which had small native populations, Britain shipped their excess population off to these countries or to these colonies, and mostly what they did was ship off British nationals. So for a country like the United States, our history of colonization, while we, got sick of having the British and threw them off in a revolution, but it wasn't the same experience that a country would have, especially the Latin American, Asian, African countries who were colonized not so that population could be relocated, but to subjugate the native population. Usually these countries had large native populations. Subjugate the native population so that the colonizer country could exploit their natural resources. And that definitely India, so Britain had a totally different reason for colonizing India, they wanted tea, they wanted spices, they wanted a route to the west or to the east, all of those kind of things. They wanted land, but they mostly wanted natural resources. Same with Africa, precious metals, coal, things like that. So in general, the colonies that are colonized for population are more developed than the countries that were colonized for exploitation of natural resources. So you guys can think about that and say on your discussion board, another thing you could talk about is, why do you think that is? And if maybe by now you know whether your country was colonized or not from your basic research on the country, was your country a colony? And if so, is it experience what can you guess about its experience based on these things? So just something to think about. So obviously the economy is a huge factor in a country's development. And one element of a country's economy is understanding which sector is dominant in a country's economy. And this is going to be very important for understanding development because it kind of goes along with development. So what we call the primary economic sector in any country is two things. One is agriculture, and the other one is extraction of natural resources. By this I mean oil, coal, precious metals, salt, all kinds of things like that. And so every country has a primary economic sector, but if that's the dominant economic sector, in other words, if that's all the further the country has developed its economy, it's probably going to be a poorer, less developed country. Then what's called the secondary economy or the secondary economic sector is manufacturing. So normally what we see in the progression of development, not always, but normally what we see is a country going from depending primarily on agriculture, usually just to feed its population, or exportation of natural resources in order to basically sell what they've got on the global market. A country is developing when they move beyond only relying on that to also having a strong manufacturing sector. So that's factories, creating stuff. And then finally, the tertiary economy is the economy that the United States experiences most of today, which is based in our dominant economic sector is tertiary, and that is services, information and knowledge, and technology. So that is things like producing knowledge, telecommunications, for example, stuff like that. That would be considered tertiary. And so the wealthier a country is, generally, the farther along it has developed to where it's relying mostly on its tertiary economy to fund it, and those are the wealthiest countries. So one thing that we often see with a developing nation is how are they moving from a primary economic sector into the secondary and perhaps even adding in some of the tertiary economy. Going back to the primary sector of the economy, when countries rely strongly, when that's the dominant sector, the primary sector of the economy, the problem of natural resources can be huge on whether or not a country is developed or not. And so the less it has of secondary and tertiary economy, the more it's going to be relying on its primary economy, the more at risk that country is to problems of resources. And it might seem counterintuitive, but there's actually two problems. You can have too few resources, but you can also have too many natural resources. So for countries like Ethiopia that have too few natural resources, it's a desert, they have a lot of trouble with agriculture. They don't have exportable natural resources that they can sell on the global market. So a country in that situation is going to experience terrible things. They're at the mercy of the weather. If you're just trying to grow crops in a place where crops don't grow very well, you're very much at the mercy of the weather, and then that leads to famine. So if there's a drought, it leads to famine and terrible poverty. And a country like that is often going to be dependent on global charity. So there's not really a way for a country like that to move forward, or it's very, very difficult for them to move forward. And that's, I think, pretty understandable. But I think it's counterintuitive that you can have a situation called the resource curse, where a country can actually have too many resources or be too rich in natural resources. And so examples of those are like Brazil with its gorgeous rainforest, or Nigeria, which is very, very oil rich. The problem with having too many resources, it sounds like a good thing, but what it leads to is foreign governments of more developed countries and multinational corporations are going to exploit that country's resources, often by co-opting and creating a lot of government corruption. So you have, I know you guys read about Nigeria, so you have a situation where Nigeria has some leaders who are making a lot of money by being in cooperation with multinational corporations and oil corporations, and they're squandering those resources, and the benefits of them never seep into the whole economy. They're not able to be used and drawn on for creating a manufacturing sector or things like that. So there's good and bad things about resources. Okay, and finally, there's a huge primary mover in today's economically developing countries, which is how much they're participating in the global trade environment. So developing countries spend a lot of time making policy strategies to try to improve where they are in the global markets. So they may try to diversify their exports, so they're not just exporting oil or just exporting coal, but now they're exporting various commodities. They have to deal with policies to deal with competitors or competitor nations. They have to deal with the impact of tariffs from other countries. If you want to export something, you may have a country setting tariffs on that, and then that's going to cost you more to export it. And then setting tariffs oneself, does a country want to tax imports into their country? It's tempting, but then again, is that going to cause problems where people who are trying to import things are going to go elsewhere? So all of these things, imports, deciding whether you want to be a protectionist or a globalist, all of those things feed into whether a country's chances at economic development. And I'm certainly not an expert in global trade, and so I have included for our second video for this unit, there is a Khan Academy video called International Trade Explained. Oh, sorry, not Khan Academy, different organization called International Trade Explained. And I'm hoping that will help you understand what you need to know for exams and for your discussion boards as well. So that's all I've got for this video. Make sure that if you haven't already, go back and do that research to find out the UN HDI data for your country, and post that on the discussion board, or keep it somewhere safe on your computer until you're ready to post on the discussion board. And then also be sure to watch the second video in the unit, which, as I said, is not my video. So hopefully that will help you. All right, as always, if you need help, come see me in office hours. Remember, you can get 5 extra credit points for the first time you visit my office hours. Or email me, call me, whatever. I'm here to help. Have a great day.